My name is Laura Ng, and I'm an anthropology PhD candidate at Stanford University, and my talk is titled Know Your Historic Sites, Know Yourself, Stories of How Asian Americans Responded to Racism. This talk is in memory of Hank Umamoto, a Nisei who dedicated his later years to educating the public about his wartime incarceration at Manzanar. The last presentation Hank gave on Manzanar actually included the story of the Harada house, which is pictured on the right. The title for my talk is a riff off of the phrase, know your history, know yourself. Advocates of ethnic studies have taken this phrase up to argue that marginalized people would be empowered if they knew how their ancestors contributed to the establishment of this nation, as well as how they dealt with racial prejudice. In this presentation, I focus on the latter, racial prejudice, and more specifically on anti-Asian racism. I argue that historic sites not only illuminate these events, but how Asian Americans responded to racism. As historian Roger Daniels notes, we cannot only focus on what was done to oppress Asians in America, we also have to talk about what Asian Americans did about it. This prevents Asian American history from becoming a story of victimization. And as I will show in my presentation, Asian Americans did fight back against racism. The time period I focus on is the era before World War II, to show what events led up to the unjust incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. The historic sites I highlight show how dominant society put anti-Asian laws in place through local, state, and federal legislation. Systemic racism is something we're hearing a lot about right now, thanks to activists in the Black Lives Movement. The laws I'll be discussing are clear examples of how the US systematically excluded Asian Americans from full participation in American society. The enforcement of systemic racism often involved violence, imprisonment, and deportation. Although this presentation could have focused solely on the Japanese American experience and how Japanese fought racism and responded to it. But I chose to highlight the stories of various Asian ethnic groups because Asians were historically grouped together as a race that should be discriminated against and excluded in the same ways. So first, I'd like to provide some historical background for the rest of my talk. In this presentation, I focus on stories of 4 Asian ethnic groups: Filipinos, Filipinas, Chinese, South Asians, and Japanese. While we often think of Chinese immigrants who came during the gold rush to California as the first group of Asian immigrants, Asians have been in the US for a long time, since Filipinos jumped ship from Spanish galleons in New Orleans in 1763. Their descendants formed the earliest Asian American communities in the US, such as Manila Village in the Louisiana Bayou, which is depicted in this historic photo. Another important event in Filipino-American history was the US colonization of the Philippines in 1898 as a result of the Spanish-American War. A war between the US and Filipino nationalists followed. One result of US colonialism was that Filipinas were considered US nationals, and wartime upheaval spurred migration to the US and they found work on farms and canneries. The next group that I'll be focusing on are Chinese immigrants. And this group, as I said, first came through the gold rush, but after that, approximately 10,000 Chinese were recruited from villages in Guangdong, China, in order to work on the Transcontinental Railroad. More Chinese immigrants would follow to work in a variety of service industries and in building infrastructure. Others, like these men in Riverside, were merchants who provided Chinese goods to local laborers. The first Japanese American settlement in the US was located near Placerville, California. In 1869, a group of 21 men and 1 woman came from Japan to establish the Wakamatsu Tea and Silk Farm Colony, which was part of Japan's imperialist expansion. Japanese immigrants came to the US mainland in large numbers starting in 1898 when Hawaii became a US territory. Hawaiian contract labor was banned, and this was something that a lot of Japanese participated in. So this spurred migration to the mainland. Japanese women were able to immigrate to the US as picture brides. In this photo, they're waiting to be inspected at Angel Island, an immigration station that I'll be talking more about later. Most Japanese immigrants lived in the states of Washington, Oregon, and California. South Asians were another large Asian immigrant group. Almost 2,000 Punjabi men from the Punjab state in India lived in California in the early 1900s. Others lived in the Pacific Northwest and worked in the lumber mills. Most were of the Sikh religion, though a small percentage were Muslim. This is a photo of Sikhs in Stockton, California, standing in front of a temple or gurdwara. This gurdwara became an important site for gathering of Punjabis who supported the Ghadar Party, which sought to overthrow British rule in India. And here are just some references that I used for this historical background and some other readings that you could do, including also a PBS documentary that just aired called Asian Americans. So the first topic I'll be talking about is anti-Asian violence in the Pacific Northwest. In the 1880s, there were driving out campaigns against the Chinese. One instance of anti-Asian violence occurred in Tacoma, Washington, and gave birth to the quote-unquote Tacoma method for expelling Chinese. On November 3rd, 1885, 500 white residents of Tacoma marched through the city's Chinatown and stopped at every Chinese residence and business, telling the Chinese to get on wagons or on a train headed to Portland, Oregon. Several days later, the mob burned the entire Chinese community to the ground. The leaders of the mob were never indicted, and this fueled more anti-Asian expulsion in the Pacific Northwest. Sikh immigrants were also the target of anti-Asian sentiment. In this 1906 newspaper article, the newspaper asked, "Do we have a dusky peril?" And this was an article that was trying to portray Sikh immigrants, or Hindus as they call them, as hordes that needed to be stopped. The year after this was published, in 1907, 500 white men in Bellingham, Washington, attacked Sikhs who were living there. The mob broke windows, threw rocks, and pulled Sikhs from their workplaces and homes. For their safety, the Sikhs stayed in the basement of City Hall overnight. This photo on the right shows the day after the riot coming out of City Hall. According to historian Seema Sohai, these white workers were scapegoating Sikhs for taking their lumber mill jobs. After this episode of racial terror, Sikhs left the area and never came back because they knew that the police would not protect them in the future. This idea of Asians as a peril continued. As you can see in this newspaper from 1908, the terror is now the yellow peril, and specifically the yellow peril was in support of anti-Japanese immigration. And this newspaper, part of it reads, "The intention of the inhabitants of this continent is to prevent conquest of our territory and destruction of the white race in the future, which would be the inevitable consequences of unchecked invasion by yellow people from Asia. So this was the sentiment at the time. And what's interesting is that this term, yellow peril, is actually something that's been reclaimed by Asian American activists. We've seen this recently in the support of the Black Lives Movement, and specifically this term, yellow peril, supports Black power, which was first used and documented in 1966 during a solidarity protest for Black power. And this is a photo of Japanese American activist Richard Aoki holding the yellow peril supports Black power sign, inverting that stereotype as a yellow peril to show solidarity with Black Americans who were being oppressed at the time. Interestingly, as a side note, Richard Aoki is thought to have actually been an FBI informant, although evidence that is disputed. And this idea of yellow peril is a bit controversial because it doesn't represent, the word yellow doesn't represent all Asian ethnic groups. And here are some texts that you can read for further information on the Tacoma method, especially, and the Bellingham rights. Next section, I'll be talking about Asian exclusion legislation in the United States. So the first piece of legislation to ban an entire group based on their ethnic or racial circumstances is the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. And this was an act that banned Chinese laborers from the United States. So essentially, it was successful in stopping Chinese immigration. But what followed was more anti-Asian legislation. In 1905, with the formation of the Asiatic Exclusion League, a group of anti-Asian labor union members in San Francisco, California, they called for stopping Japanese immigration, and were pretty successful, along with other politicians who ran with this anti-Asian sentiment. And in 1907, the Gentleman's Agreement was something the US and Japan agreed upon, where Japan would stop issuing passports for Japanese laborers. In exchange, the US would allow Japanese students to go to school with white students. They had previously been segregated, and this was a great embarrassment to Japan at the time. So one site that was in charge of enforcing Asian exclusion is the Angel Island Immigration Station, which was located right outside of San Francisco. And the purpose of the immigration station was not to necessarily to welcome immigrants, but to exclude them. So during the period of Chinese exclusion, the Angel Island Immigration Station processed every single Chinese that landed in San Francisco, no matter if they were part of the exempt class, which included merchants and their family members, or US-born Chinese and their sons or daughters. So Angel Island was a place where Chinese were interrogated and sometimes asked dozens up to hundreds of questions about their identity, their family members, details about their village, and it had to match with the relatives in the US or other people who knew them in China. And if the answers weren't to the immigration inspector's satisfaction, then the Chinese were detained, sometimes for a few days, sometimes for months, until the identities could be checked. So other Asian immigrant groups, like Japanese, had to go through this. Immigrants from India also came through Angel Island. And in 1935, with the passage of the Tidings-McDuffie Act, the Philippines was granted independence from the United States. Filipinos were no longer US nationals and were subject to deportation and detention at Angel Island. And according to historian Don Mavalon, one newspaper in 1937 reported prison-like conditions on Angel Island, and one person stated that Angel Island was a misnomer and referred to it as the Devil's Island instead. So Angel Island is clearly a contrast to Ellis Island, which is thought of as an immigration station that welcomed immigrants with open arms. And of course, most Asian immigrants were processed through Angel Island rather than Ellis Island. So Angel Island has a history of being a detention facility for Chinese immigrants and other Asian ethnic groups. And an interesting parallel is that even after the facility shut down in 1940, it served as a detention center for Japanese immigrants during World War II. And this is a recent story about these immigrants who were detained at Angel Island. Most were picked up by the FBI following Japan's bombing of Pearl Harbor, and many were leaders in the Japanese American community. Some came from Hawaii and were en route to other internment camps in the United States, and some were from the Bay Area. And none of them went to trial. Most went through a kangaroo court, and they were only picked up because the FBI had been keeping tabs on all Japanese immigrants before Pearl Harbor. So how did people subvert all these exclusion laws? Well, the Chinese used a method called the paper sun method, and this was basically purchasing legal immigration documents based on the idea that they were the son of native sons. And this was possible because of the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, which destroyed the immigration papers of many Chinese, who then claimed US citizenship. And they were able to sell so-called slots to prospective immigrants because sons of native sons could immigrate to the US, were exempt from the Chinese exclusion law. And one example is Boy Wang, who immigrated under the name Gao Doi Wang and was able to pass the interrogation, pass through Angel Island, and come to the United States. So here are some references related to Angel Island and to the Filipino-American experience in particular. and also to the Angel Island Immigration Station as a detention center, and actually other places such as Ellis Island and East Boston immigration stations served a similar purpose during World War II. So my third section that I'll be focusing on is the alien land laws and Asian American land ownership. So in California and many other states, Asian immigrants were deemed aliens ineligible for citizenship and therefore could not own land. So if you're not white or black, you could not own land. So essentially this was targeted at Japanese agricultural workers who whites saw as competition and did not want them to own land. This law was renewed in California in 1920 and was even more restrictive. So one way one family fought against this was by putting their land under their children's names. And so in the case of Jukichi Harada, a Japanese immigrant who purchased a single-story cottage in 1915 in Riverside, California. As a Japanese immigrant, he could not own land. Put the name in his children's property. His neighbor did not want him to live next door to him, and the state attempted to seize his property. A court case ensued, and the judge ruled in Harada's favor, and he was able to retain ownership of the house. And this house is now a National Historic Landmark because of its civil rights importance. And so this had important repercussions for other Japanese Americans and even Chinese immigrants and other Japanese immigrants who were able to own residences because they placed it in their children's names. And this law was eventually overturned in 1952 when Japanese immigrant Sei Fuji, a lawyer, challenged it and won. So this law was on the books for a very long time. So one interesting connection to the Harada's case is the idea of birthright citizenship, and that their children were able to become citizens just by their right of being born in the United States. And this idea was actually won by a Chinese American named Wong Kim Ark, who was born in San Francisco. He was denied entry after visiting China because he was a laborer, a non-exempt class under the Chinese Exclusion Act. But with the help of a Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association, he was able to asserted that he was a U.S. citizen born on American soil. He won his case in 1896, and since then, all children of immigrants born in the U.S. have birthright citizenship. And here are some books, documentaries to watch that are relevant. So my final section is on Asian farmers in Southern California. So one occupation that many Asian ethnic groups shared was farming, and this is because agriculture was an occupation they were allowed to do, and they were excluded from a lot of other job opportunities. And here's a picture of the San Pedro Vegetables Growers Association in 1919, a group of Japanese American farmers. So one way that Asian immigrants were able to succeed in farming and selling their farm products was by forming the markets, and one example is the Los Angeles City Market. So this was a area where farmers or vegetable sellers could sell their produce. And this one in particular was started by a Chinese immigrant named Louis Guan. But because he knew that society was racist, he appointed Frank Simpson, a white man, as president. And the success of the city market, which started in 1909, hinged on collaboration between Chinese and Japanese farmers. So as you can see in this shareholders list, 158 shareholders were Chinese, 65 were Japanese, and 19 were white. And at one point, the white shareholders were going to pull their stock, and they did, and the Chinese and Japanese were able to come together and come up with more shares to save the city market. Another interesting inter-ethnic show of solidarity is related to Punjabi farmers and the various anti-Asian laws they faced. So most Punjabi farmers in the 1900s worked in the Imperial Valley near San Diego, California. And they were subject to the alien land laws, of course, so they couldn't own land as Asian immigrants. In 1905, a California statute prohibited interracial marriage between whites and other races, but specifically was trying to prevent interracial marriages between whites and Asians. And then they were also subject to the 1917 Immigration Act, which specifically was trying to bar immigration from India because through the Asiatic barred zone. And as I said earlier, the Japanese and Chinese were already excluded from the country, essentially. So, well, how did Punjabi farmers react to this racism? They intermarried with many Mexican women who were local to the area. And so they were able to circumvent the laws that prevented Indian women from immigrating, and also were able to put roots down in California. And here are some references that shed further light on the Punjabi-Mexican interracial marriages, and then more about the city market and farming, Asian farming in general. So I'd like to conclude my talk with 5 points. First, Asians are a diverse group, but face similar types of race-based exclusion, as I've shown. One type of racism towards one group tends to end up affecting every Asian group. Second, Asian Americans often combated racism through the legal system and through solidarity with other ethnic groups. So we see that in the Harada case, Wong Kim Ark, the fighting through the legal system, and then, interracial or inter-ethnic solidarity by working together, even though in many cases they were competing in the same industry. Third, dominant society did little to give Asians any rights or to protect them from violence. So again, racism is systemic, and anti-Asian rhetoric, the yellow peril, the dusky peril, would often turn into exclusionary laws and even violence for Asian immigrants. Fourth, racism, once for one group led to racism against another, and also because this was systemic, it was something that was approved by local law enforcement, by state officials, and then federal politicians. So there was a whole hierarchy in place, and Asians were not at the top. And also, it's important to trace the genealogy of racism to help us understand the present day. And I think this is important and relevant to today's Black Lives movement, Black Lives Matter movement, as well as racism against Asians during COVID-19. This, looking back into time, shows that there's always been structures in place that have condoned violence against marginalized racial groups, and that these problems we're facing today have that long history, and not just for every ethnic and racial group in the United States. Thank you.